I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. Timothy Smith was always true to his craft. He wasn't afraid to break away from the pack and do his own reporting. He was an objective journalist, but he could also get close enough to understand different perspectives, especially of athletes in brutal sports like pro football and boxing. I'm excited about getting his perspective on 3 decades of covering sports. Hey, Tim, welcome to the show. I've been thinking about the first time we met, and I had to go to the Wayback Machine, back to the late 80s.
Yeah. I it's so long ago, I can't remember. Because when I came to Cincinnati, my wife was pregnant with my oldest daughter, and we moved from Atlanta.
So we met in those days in the late 80s, and then you went on to New York, where really you spent the bulk of your career at the New York Times and the New York Daily News. And as we unfold this show, I wanted to just ask you in general, when you think back of your career, almost a quarter century in New York, what was it like to be a sports writer in New York City, the media capital of the world?
Well, when I left Cincinnati to come to New York, this is what I always thought, that New York was just, particularly with sports, that it was just this cutthroat, incredible, I'm going to sink. I thought, I had so much trepidation and fear coming into that setting. And then, I went to cover the New York Jets, and I had been covering the Cincinnati Bengals, and I had been working, my competition at the Cincinnati Post was the great Jack Brennan.
Right.
And so Jack and I don't know if you remember the old Wile E. Coyote cartoon, but there was the thing about the sheepdog would clock in every day, and Wile E. Coyote would clock in every day, and they would spend the whole day like trying to beat the hell out of each other.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Right.
So Jack and I would spend the day like just in the corners, like whispering to people, and then without the internet, you would have to wait until the next day and pick up the paper to find out what all the whispering was about, right? But,
right.
We clocked in every day. We did our own thing, and, he beat me, I beat him, the same. Just hand-to-hand combat every day. And I thought, this is going to be useful when I get to New York, because now I'm competing not only with one person, I'm competing with all these other newspapers and all this kind of stuff. So, I was a little nervous coming to New York and coming to that setting. But when I got to the Jets, I found the environment was, completely different, that there was almost like I don't know, there was like this, that all the guys worked together. And I'm like, what are you doing? They'd be like, hey, who talked to Eric McMillan? Somebody have any Eric McMillan quotes? I'll trade you Eric McMillan quotes for, Ken O'Brien quotes, because I didn't talk to Ken O'Brien today. And I'm sitting in the room and I'm going like, there are like 9 reporters in there, and they're swapping quotes between each other.
Yeah, what is this, right?
Yeah, I'm like, what is this?
This is the cutthroat New York media, really?
Yeah, this is the cutthroat New York media. But somebody explained to me, like, they got sort of tired of like their bosses, yelling at them every morning going, hey, why didn't you have this? Or you weren't working hard enough. So they decided to just like, on some of the stories to just like, share information. And I was like, I ain't sharing nothing, man. I would just like do my own thing, and
that's really interesting, because like you said, you would think it'd be the opposite,
Yeah. You would think all these guys would be out there just like trying to beat each other over the heads with whatever they could get. And it was, that was like my first experience of coming into New York. And then once I did that, I was like, you know what? This is going to be, if you just use your journalistic skills, this is going to be, a pretty decent setup, because you have those guys, like you said, they just had that attitude. But yeah, I learned from that in terms of covering a beat, that you got to be your own man and do your own thing. Yeah.
Well, that's what I learned too, because when I met you, I was right out of college in the late 80s, and I was Jack Brennan's backup guy on the beat. And hell, I didn't even think I was allowed to talk to you, Tim. But what I found, though, is that you were a very nice guy. And, we got to know each other and became friends. But you're right. It was a different type of atmosphere. And I think a lot of that had to do with, it was a smaller city, but almost in a weird way, more attention on that one thing then. So you had a morning paper and an afternoon paper, and there weren't a bunch of pro teams during football season. It was the Bengals, and so people were into it, and and it was let's get after it.
But I started thinking about that. That's probably one of the last cities that I could think of, other than major cities, that had a morning and an afternoon paper.
Right.
It was such a weird kind of, dynamic that late in the game, because mostly all the papers had sort of combined and everything.
And you also had such a team, a very talented team in the Bengals of those days, with a lot of great talkers, a lot of guys who went on to do media careers, really.
Yeah. And Collinsworth is still doing it.
Yeah, Chris Collinsworth, Boomer Esiason, Solomon Wilcots. You had all these guys. And it was a great locker room. So for a young guy like me to walk in, it was really eye-opening to this is what the business is like. And then you had a head coach like Sam Wyche. And Sam would meet you 3 times a day. He didn't care. I mean, he was talking, and training camp, his room was down the hall from you at Wilmington College. You just go down and knock on Sam's door in the evening.
And he'd fill your notebook.
He'd fill your notebook. It was
every day.
Incredible. I was thinking a lot about Sam when he passed a couple of years ago. Such a brilliant offensive mind and just a different character. We covered a lot of coaches in our careers, but covering Sam to me was so unique. What do you recall about covering Sam, other than the fact that he liked to talk?
I remember one Saturday morning, I had my 2 daughters, and one was like a toddler, and the other one was, not too far from a toddler. She might have been 3. And so I went to the walkthrough, because nothing ever happens at a walkthrough. And
except
on this day, they were playing Tampa Bay. And I'm trying to remember the defensive end's name. The first name was Jim. But anyway.
Jim Scow.
Jim Scow. They traded him Saturday to Tampa Bay. So I'm there with my 2 kids, and I say to Sam, Sam, I got to go in and talk to Jim. Can you watch my kids? And Sam said, no problem. He's like, I got a daughter, no problem. He said, bring them to the office and, sit the little one here in this chair and, put the other one here. And, he said, you're not going to be long. So just sit him here. He said, I'll watch him. No problem. Right. So I go and I said, I'm going to take the baby. I said, just watch the toddler. I said, I'm going to take the baby with me. So I'm standing there. Jim Scow is in tears. I'm balancing a baby. I'm trying to take notes. He's crestfallen because, the Bengals were a good team. Right. And Tampa sucked, and he was getting traded, right? So I'm balancing, the child, and I'm taking notes, and Jim is just he must think he's in a Fellini movie, because here's a guy talking to him with a baby at the worst point of his career at this point.
And meanwhile, Sam is watching your other child.
And I'm thinking, what the heck is Sam doing? So I come out of the locker room, and I don't know if you remember that little trailer thing they had.
Oh, yeah. Literally a trailer, right.
Yeah, it was literally a trailer. But there was that long hallway with the coaches' offices and stuff, and Sam had an office. And so I leave the locker room, and I see my kid just running down the hallway, and she's just giggling and laughing and everything. And she's just bouncing off the walls and running and, just running through the hallways and everything. And I'm like, what? So I go to Sam and said, Sam, why is this child so energetic? And he's like, oh, we've just been eating candy. And I was like, her mother doesn't give her candy. She's on a sugar high, man. Sam's fed my kid all this candy to keep her quiet while I'm in the locker room.
That was probably the end of Sam's babysitting career. One other thing about Sam was that he was such a complex guy, that there were things about him that weren't good too, in terms of, I mean, you were at the game in Seattle in 1990, and after they lost to the Seahawks, he barred Denise Tom from USA Today from entering the locker room. And like, what are you doing, dude? I mean, seriously.
I didn't understand that, because it didn't really fit into who the man was. I mean, he would always tell the story about how, he roomed with like one of the first gay players. What was the guy's name? Jerry Smith or something with the Washington Redskins. He roomed with like one of the first gay players. I mean, he was like such an open-minded guy that it was hard for me to reconcile a guy who was so innovative and open-minded and progressive in his thinking with being just a caveman and a Neanderthal when it came to this issue. And I remember when, Denise came back to the press box and she was saying, Sam Wyche, locked me out of the dressing room. And I said to her, no, it must have been a security guy. And she said, no, it was Sam himself, because the security guy said that Sam had given the order not to let any women in the locker room. And I was like, nah, it couldn't have been Sam. I couldn't reconcile. So I called the hotel and I got Sam on the phone at the hotel. And, Sam is going through all of this stuff that, we don't conduct business in the nude, and the Supreme Court, they're not naked when they render these decisions. And, and I got a responsibility to the wives of these athletes and not to have them being naked in front of other women. And I'm like, where is this coming from?
Right. Where, Sam? I mean, seriously.
Yeah. So I said to him, this is the only time that I have ever done this in my entire career. And I said, Sam, you don't want to say this. You don't want to do this. Because I knew that the commissioner was coming into town. I knew Tagliabue was coming into town to talk about, to meet with some business leaders in Seattle, like the very next day. Mm-hmm. And I said, Sam, you don't want to do this. He's like, yes, I do. He's like, I want to be on the record. I said, Sam, for the second time, you don't want to do this. And he says, yeah, I do want to do this because it's something that needs to be said. And if I don't say it, then who's going to say it? And I said, okay, it's your funeral. So I wrote the story. And the weird thing was the story didn't run in the Cincinnati Enquirer because it was after deadline.
Right. It was so late.
When I got the story. But I gave the quotes to a reporter from the LA Times, and he, credited me with getting Sam, and which was a weird kind of thing because the story wasn't in the Cincinnati Enquirer. But the very next day, the commissioner came down so hard on Sam, because Sam embarrassed the commissioner, embarrassed the league, and here's the commissioner speaking to business leaders in Seattle, and he's got this coach that's completely out of step with the way things should be done. There's no reason.
And it was only 2 weeks after Lisa Olson had been harassed in the New England players' locker room. So
and I mean, the timing of it, and I still remember Sam doing his weekly press conference because they stayed in Seattle because they were going to go down to LA to play the Rams the next week. So they decided to stay in Seattle. And I still remember Sam doing his Wednesday press conference in a loincloth.
Oh, God.
At a pool.
Jesus.
At an indoor pool at the hotel. And he's like, yeah, you're gonna say I'm a caveman. I'm gonna dress like a caveman. And I'm like,
Yeah, there was obviously never a dull moment with Sam. Well, Tim, after you left Sam, you did go to the New York Times and you started out there, covering the JETS, Jets. So your time in the NFL, when you think about it, what did you like about covering the NFL?
The main thing that I like, and to this day, it's still the thing that sort of, propels me as a fan of the sport, is I like the players. I mean, I just like.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
I like the players, and I formed my relationship more with the players and their agents in terms of like just players' movement and stuff. And I would always side with the players against the league. But because I worked at the New York Times, they couldn't take too much of an adversarial relationship with me because they needed the New York Times. But I was always on the player side.
I always felt like they played such a violent game that their careers could end at any moment, that there was almost a humility to them that you wouldn't expect from these big, brawly guys. And they also, even if they weren't Rhodes Scholars, they went to college and were exposed to other things on a campus. And it just gave them a different perspective. That's my memory of dealing with NFL players.
It gave them a different perspective, and it allowed them to have a level of communication skills that perhaps, some athletes, like baseball players, that I think baseball players, because of the way that they have to come up, through Class A and riding on a bus and having sort of that insular lifestyle where they're only dealing with their teammates and everything.
Right.
And they don't really deal in the smaller towns. They're not dealing with a lot of press, that they really can't maneuver through those kinds of relationships so well. But with football players, I always felt like I could build a relationship with a football player. But my thing about covering the league was I liked the players more than I liked the league itself. And,
I agree.
And that's because the league is a corporation, it's a business, and it's, and the commissioner is beholden to the individual owners of the teams, and their business conflicts with the workers in so many different ways. I always thought one of the biggest oxymorons was a team doctor.
Yeah, right. He gets paid by the club, right?
He gets paid by the club to put you back out when, if you went to your regular physician and you had this injury, your regular primary care doctor would be like, no, go home and rest. You can't. No, you're not going to be running around and getting hit by a 260-pound man on Sunday.
Oh, I remember Bruce Kozerski, offensive lineman at the Cincinnati Bengals. He once told me, he explained the injury report to me. He said, if it says probable, you're playing. If it says doubtful, you're probable. And if it says out, you're probably going to play. He was sort of joking, but not really.
Yeah, not really.
They are the gladiators, right?
Yeah.
Well, you wrote about much more than just the NFL in your time in New York. I mean, as a columnist at the New York Daily News, you wrote about everything, the pro teams, NBA, Major League Baseball. There's a baseball story I wanted to ask you about, Tim. I think you once mentioned that you got sent to the Bahamas to write about El Duque. Is that right?
Yeah, so I got sent to Miami to cover the Orange Bowl, and I covered the Orange Bowl for one day. That was photo day. And then I got a call from the editor that said, hey, this Cuban baseball player was just rescued from an atoll near the Bahamas, and he's in a Bahamian detention center. Can you get down to the Bahamas and, track the story down and find this guy? And I'm like, wait a minute. I don't know anything about the Bahamas. I don't know where the detention center is. And he's like, yeah, just go down there and report the story. And I was like, okay.
Just another day at the office.
So I get on a plane, and I just happened to be at the airport with the photographer. They sent a photographer along, somebody that spoke Spanish. So they sent me with this photographer. And when I got to the Bahamas, I landed at the airport, and there was a reporter from the Miami Herald there that I knew from covering, football, Armando Salguero.
Right.
He was there. So he said, well, why don't we just ride together to this detention center? And I was like, okay.
And you're looking for Orlando Hernandez, the pitcher.
And I'm looking for Orlando Hernandez, El Duque.
Right.
Who, along with like 5 other people, gets into this makeshift raft and tries to escape Cuba and ends up, on an atoll outside the Bahamas for like 3 days. And, so we get to the detention center, the taxi, and we tell the taxi, look, there's money in it, but you just got to wait for us until we figure out where we have to go from this point. And this is like one of those bad movies where as soon as you get out of the taxi, it just speeds off. And so we go up to the fence, and we don't see him. So this guy comes over and he says, because he saw the photographer with the camera, and he says, are you guys looking for the baseball player? And we're like, yeah. And he says, he's here. And we go, okay, good. Where is he? He says, he's in that building over there. So we go, okay, well, we're just going to stake this place out. So so they bring him out of the building and they put him in a van, and the van leaves. We're there with no way to follow the van or know where it's going.
Yeah, because the taxi guy bolted.
The taxi guy bolted, right? So we asked the guy at the fence, and he says, well, they're taking him to, the government offices, downtown, where they're going to try to, figure out what to do with him and process him. So we were like, okay, now we know where he went. Now, how do we get there? So this old woman drives by, so we flag her down, and we go, ma'am, if you don't mind, because this place is in the middle of nowhere. Ma'am, if you don't mind, can you take us to this government center downtown? And she's like, well, I came out here to visit my son, but she's like, I think that God put me here to do you guys a favor. So, yeah, I'll take you. So we were like, thank God.
Yeah, an angel.
Yeah, exactly, right? So she takes us, and she has on the back seat of the car, she has like dozens of eggs. I don't know how many eggs there were, but they were stacked in these little crates and everything. And she's like, just put the eggs in there. Be careful, put the eggs in the trunk. I don't need any of them broken. And, so we carefully put the eggs in the trunk. And the photographer is like, well, ma'am, I got all this gear. You mind if I put my gear in the trunk, but I'll make sure that the eggs aren't broken. She's like, yeah, no problem. So the photographer puts all of his gear in the trunk. We pile into the car. So she takes us to the center. So she drops us off and she points out where, the center is. The photographer reaches into the trunk to get his equipment. Every single egg is busted.
Oh, shit. Scrambled.
Scrambled. Every egg in the trunk is scrambled. So we're like, oh, geez, we just ruined this woman's. So we're like, we can't, the woman's like, she won't take any money because she says God sent her to help us out. So we throw like $50 in the trunk with the busted eggs so she can, so she won't curse us out whenever she gets where she's going with these eggs.
By the way, how did you put that on your expense account?
Yeah, $50 for busted eggs.
Okay.
You don't expense that. You just, you leave that alone.
I thought that was a dinner. Sorry. So did you get to talk to Hernandez at some point?
So we go in, and it's like him and like 4 other people, and, they start telling the story, but they're telling the story in Spanish, and I don't understand a word of Spanish. So the photographer is standing next to me, and he's translating. And
he's got egg all over his equipment, and he's translating.
And he's translating, and it's very emotional. El Duque is crying and talking about, how God saved them, and if the ship hadn't come by, they had run out of food. There was no fresh water, and they were catching rainwater and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, this is a great story. I wish I could hear it in the original language, to try to capture some of this. So I captured the emotion, but the language. So when we're there, this baseball agent shows up, and, we see him like passing out money to some of the officials. And so we go, okay, this isn't going to take long. This guy's going to be free pretty soon, but we don't know where he's going to go. And so the agent is like, well, he can't come to America, because if he comes to America, then his baseball rights become open to everybody. Mm-hmm. He said, but if he goes to Costa Rica, he can just make a deal directly with the Yankees, which is what he wanted to.
So the Yankees were making sure he's heading to Costa Rica.
The Yankees were pulling the strings to make sure that he goes to Costa Rica. So he ends up going to Costa Rica, and he ends up signing with the Yankees and becoming El Duque.
Well, the story, and then the story ends up being a little questioned, right? I mean, they're 10 hours on this raft, 8 guys from Cuba. Yes. They're swimming, There's sharks. Yes. And then you're like, later it's like, did that really happen?
No, they plucked this guy. He left Cuba, and somebody plucked him out of the water on the way to wherever and dumped him. This is just personally what I think. I think the guy got plucked out of the water to come by the atoll, and it happened to be near the Bahamas, and then they took him to Bahamas, and then they worked this whole thing out to get him to Costa Rica.
I think the Yankees had some guy, George Costanza, come up with a story about sharks and swimming and 10 hours.
And opening your mouth for rainwater. And
Hey. Truth always reminds me of the great boxing promoter Bob Arum, who once said, "Yesterday I was lying. Today I'm telling the truth."
Absolutely. Yes.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.
Well, I'll tell you what, there's one thing that's true about boxing is that once those guys climb in that ring, that's the true moment. That's the truth. And boxing has been such a huge part of your sports writing career, Tim. Your 3 decades plus of writing about sports, you spent many, many nights either in gyms or at prize fights. How did you originally get into covering boxing?
Well, I worked at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in the mid '80s, and right after Evander Holyfield came out of the Olympics in '84 in the LA Games, they needed somebody to cover his career, and they were going around the newsroom and saying, "Who knows anything about boxing or who likes boxing?" And I mean, I had been following the sport since I was 12 years old. The moment in the sport that sort of captured my imagination was when Ali came to the Atlanta Civic Center to fight Jerry Quarry. I followed that story. I mean, I was 12 years old. I was in the 7th or the 8th grade. I followed that story. I was fascinated by this guy coming off this, suspension and getting back in the ring.
Yeah, that was 1970, right?
Yeah. And it was just. It was just such a fascinating story that I fell in love with the story. I fell in love with Ali, and then just watching him in the ring after that, I just sort of fell in love with the sport.
There was also something about writing in boxing too, right? It lent itself to it, right?
Yes, the drama of what goes on in the ring, the passion and the heart and the determination. I mean, it sort of just lends itself to all of those elements that you need for a great story.
Yeah, and there's characters. I mean, there's these people that show up. They're just dropped out of some kind of storyline and fed to you. I mean, think about a guy like Lou Duva, right? A guy that you wrote a book with, Lou Duva, Fighting Life. The guy spent 7 decades in boxing as an iconic manager and trainer. You couldn't create Lou Duva.
If you went to Central Casting and said, "Give me the old grizzled veteran boxing guy, with the twisted nose," and really, basically, you would have the Burgess Meredith from Rocky.
He'll kill you dead, Rock.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's basically, and people look at that and they think that's the caricature, but it's not. That is what trainers are. I mean, that's what old school boxing trainers were that guy.
Duva signed a lot of those guys from that great '84 Olympic team. Whitaker, Breland, Meldrick Taylor, Tyrell Biggs, and Holyfield.
Yeah. I mean, I think they had, of that class, I think they ended up signing 8 of the guys from that boxing team. I think there were 12 guys on the team. I think they ended up signing 8 of the 12.
So you're in Atlanta, and Holyfield is the guy. He's one of the guys signed. So you became a Holyfield writer, right?
I became the Holyfield writer, by extension, the boxing writer. At some point, then I'm covering all of boxing by virtue of Holyfield. So it sort of happened the same way when I went to Cincinnati. I'm covering all of boxing by virtue of Aaron Pryor. But that was the start of my boxing writing career, and still to this day, one of the greatest boxing matches I've ever witnessed live was Evander Holyfield and Dwight Muhammad Cowie in the undisputed cruiserweight championship fight at the old Omni Arena in Atlanta.
All right, well, tell us about it.
It was basically a war of attrition. It was a brutal back and forth. It was one of the last 15-round fights. They eliminated 15-round fights like the next year after that. It was, I've never seen two men give or take as much punishment as I saw that afternoon. And it was just, it was almost like Thriller in Manila type level of drama. It's like you didn't know who was getting the best of whoever. And Holyfield ended up winning a majority decision. That's how close the fight was. And after the fight, he had to go to the hospital because his kidneys were on the verge of shutting down. Damn. He had lost so much body fluid from sweating and getting hitting the kidney so much that he ended up in the hospital, and they had to replenish his fluids and keep his kidneys from shutting down.
Oh, my. I mean, he could have died.
He could have died.
Unfortunately, that has happened, obviously, over the years in boxing.
Yeah, that could have happened that very day. And that's when I knew that, that it takes a very special kind of athlete to do this. First of all, and it's counterintuitive. It doesn't make any sense at all because most athletes in a sport, they get themselves in peak physical condition to perform at their very best to carry out whatever athletic, responsibilities they have on the field. But none of them go into the contest knowing that they're not going to come out of the contest the same way that they went in. And none of them go in with at least in the back of their mind, that there's a possibility they could die. Maybe race car drivers, think that there's a possibility that, I could get in a crash and die. But boxers, that's at the forefront of every boxer knows that they're not going to come out the same way that they went in.
Yeah. Unfortunately, look how a lot of them end up, right?
And a lot of them end up and they take it. That's why from a business standpoint, you want these guys to make as much money as they possibly can and then walk away.
Get out.
Before it's too late. Just get in, make your money, and get out.
Well, you saw Holyfield that day in that unbelievable fight, and then he, after being cruiserweight champ, he moves up to become the heavyweight champ when he beat Buster Douglas in 1990. And Holyfield's the only 4-time heavyweight world champ?
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about a special breed of fighter. What do you remember about Holyfield, covering him? What sticks in your craw about him as a person and him as a fighter?
He was flawed on some level. He was a flawed guy. I mean, he had like 15 million kids. And I remember Lou Duva once said that, and he was supposed to be like, have all these Christian values and everything. And Lou Duva once said that, there was only one command that he couldn't keep of the 10 commandments, and that was thou shalt not commit adultery. But he was probably one of the single most disciplined athletes that I have ever encountered in all of my years of covering sport. Floyd Mayweather is probably up there with Evander Holyfield in terms of being disciplined. And I remember being at a press conference, and Evander Holyfield, there was this humongous chocolate chip cookie. And Evander Holyfield was a heavyweight, and I pointed to the cookie and I said, "Man, you can eat that." I said, "You're not like these smaller guys that can't eat these cookies."
Hold on a second. Only a sports writer would notice the cookie.
Of course, it was a great cookie. I don't want to sound like your former president, where he talked about a piece of chocolate cake, but this was an impressive chocolate chip cookie.
I can picture it right now.
This cookie must have been about 6 inches in diameter, and it was loaded with tremendous chocolate chips. It was like the most impressive chocolate chip cookie I've ever seen.
Sounds like a sewer plate you could eat.
Yes, it was like a manhole cover.
So that cookie's sitting there in front of Holyfield. What happens?
Yeah, and I said to him, I said, unlike these smaller guys who got to make weight, you're a heavyweight. You could eat that cookie. And he looks at me and he goes, "You know why I'm not eating that cookie?" And I said, "No, why?" He said, "That's a 2-mile cookie." I said, "A 2-mile cookie? What are you talking about?" He said, If I ate that cookie, I would have to run 2 miles to burn that cookie off. And he said it's not worth it for me to eat that cookie and have to run an extra 2 miles to burn it off.
Wow. Now that's discipline.
He was one of the most dedicated guys that I just dedicated to his body, in like keeping his body in like great shape. And he never, ever
like you
got
and I.
out of shape. Yeah, sort of like me.
Yeah. Did you eat that cookie, by the way?
I ate 2 of those cookies.
Hell yeah.
And I didn't run 4 miles afterwards.
Hell yeah. I don't even like to drive 4 miles. I ain't running 4 miles. Give me that cookie.
But that was the thing that sort of struck me, that this guy was completely disciplined in his athletic life, but on some levels outside of that, not so disciplined.
How did that discipline pay off in the type of fighter Holyfield was once he got into the ring?
Well, I think it just sort of fed into his confidence and his warrior mentality, that he knew that he was, in great shape, and he knew that he didn't have very many physical limitations when he got into the ring. And so he was willing to push beyond whatever it was that was in front of him, whether that was pain, whether it was exhaustion, whatever it was, he was always willing to push beyond that limit. And, he was always the smaller heavyweight when he got into the ring. I mean, everybody was always much bigger than him. And I think that, his discipline sort of fueled that confidence that I'm going to go in, I'm going to be the David, they're going to be the Goliath, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to beat these bigger guys, that I just have the confidence in my own abilities. I have the confidence in my own training. I have the confidence in my own discipline that I'm going to be able to do that. And I think that fueled him to go to the mat with all of these big guys. He fought everybody.
Do you have a favorite Holyfield fight that you covered? Besides the one you mentioned when he was a cruiserweight, I'm talking about the heavyweight fights.
The heavyweight fights, probably the first Tyson fight. The bite fight was the result of the first one, because no one thought that he would be able to beat Mike Tyson. But Holyfield had told me long before he fought Tyson that he had a mental edge against Tyson. And it happened that they were in the same Olympic class, and they were in the same Olympic training facility, and I think it was in Colorado Springs. Mm-hmm. And Tyson was a bully. And Holyfield tells a story about how he walks into the rec room, and Tyson is bullying some other boxers in the rec room to just take over the games and do all this stuff. And Evander Holyfield stood up to Mike Tyson, and Mike Tyson backed down. And he said, I knew at that point if we ever fought, I was going to beat him. Because he said he was a bully, and I know if I press the situation, he's going to back down.
He proved it right. Yeah.
And he said that was the knowledge that he had, and that was the knowledge that a lot of people didn't have, when they made him like this incredibly long odds that he couldn't beat, this fierce, Mike Tyson. He knew that he could. And, he went in the ring and he beat the guy. He bullied the bully.
When you think about Tyson, what comes to mind in your years of covering him?
Really just a vulnerable kid. And I still think that there's just some vulnerability still there. And I think that obviously, and I'm not going to play amateur psychiatrist and put this guy on a couch or anything like that. But his whole persona was put forth to try to hide his weaknesses and his fears.
So the whole thing with wearing the black trunks, no robe, the towel,
the intimidation, the whole thing, was all about, I'm gonna show you that I'm better than you. You're gonna be scared of me so that whatever fear I have inside doesn't come out. He used his own fear as a weapon, to try to make other people afraid of him, to build himself up. And I still remember there was an incident between me and him. I was like the only American reporter that had gone over to England to cover his fight against this British guy, Julius Francis.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't going to talk to any reporters or anything. But because I came over from America and he knew me, he agreed to do an interview with me. And I never will forget it. It was in a ballroom in the Grosvenor Hotel in London. We had a long conversation. It was like a 45-minute chat. We had a long conversation. And at the end of the conversation, as a reporter, you just try to get out of a conversation on an upbeat note. So I asked him, I said, have you ever, what did you do in London that was fun? Did you have any fun while you were here?
Mm-hmm.
Did you see any sights? And he said, yeah, I saw Big Ben. And he said, I went to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. And, I said to him, I said, well, it's a famous museum. Do they have any figures of you in there? And he said, nah. And he said, no, they don't. But if they did, it would probably be in the Chamber of Horrors. Everybody in the room laughed, including Tyson. And I laughed and I was like, well, thanks, Mike, for the time. And I'm getting ready to walk away and he grabs me by the arm. And I can still see it to this day. He grabs me by the arm and he's drinking a bottle of water. And he sets the water down. He grabs me by the arm and he says, I want to tell you something. And I was like, okay, Mike. And he says, he said, I want to tell you how people treat me. And he said, I was going through the museum in Hollywood, on Hollywood and Vine. He said, then I was in there with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I was going through a museum. And then he said, they took me to the Chamber of Horrors. And he said, and they had me in the Chamber of Horrors with all of these terrible people, Hannibal Lecter, the creature from the Black Lagoon, and I'm standing there. And he said, look how people humiliate me. He said, people always want to cause me pain. And he starts to choke up like he's about to cry.
Mm.
And so I'm like, okay, I'm feeling a little sympathy. 20 seconds later, he's going, people are always, and he starts to get angry. He's like, people are always trying to make me feel pain. He said, that's why I only want to make people feel pain. I want to hurt people, make people feel pain. He said, I bet you're one of those people who want to cause me pain. And I'm like, Mike, no, I'm not one of those people. He said, I bet you are. He said, I want you to feel the same pain that I do. He said, and I hope you feel all the pain that I have inside of me. He said, I hope terrible things happen to you. I hope your kids get sick and I hope they die.
Damn.
And I'm like, where did this come from? And then the PR guy goes, okay, interview is over. And I'm like, the interview was over when I tried to walk out and he grabbed me and pulled me back. But he went on like an emotional roller coaster. He went from like nearly on the verge of tears to calming down to building this rage and this anger to lashing out at me. It was the most incredible thing that I've ever experienced in an interview in terms of just the roller coaster of emotions in about 90 seconds.
Wow.
And he still remembered that. And I remember when he was doing his Broadway, one-man Broadway play with I think Spike Lee produced it. They were at the Nederlander Theater in New York, and I went to the press conference. And I saw Mike, and I've interviewed Mike, and, I knew him, and, we knew each other, and I wouldn't say we were close, but he grabbed me, like after the interview, he grabbed me and he pulled me aside and he said, you know what, Tim? He said something that's always bothered me. He said, what I did to you in England that time in London. He's like, you remember it? I said, yeah, Mike, I remember it. He said, I got to ask you to forgive me for what I did. And I said, Mike, I forgot about it as soon as it happened. He said, no, he said, you shouldn't have forgot about it. He said, it was a horrible thing that I said. He said, I still remember what I said. He said, it was a horrible thing that I said. He said, I wish I had never said it. He said, can you find it in your heart to forgive me for that? And I said, yeah, Mike, I forgive you. I forgive you for it. He said, thank you. I appreciate you forgiving me for that. So there's like this, as he got older and where he is now, I mean, he's very self-aware now. But he's still, I don't want to say crazy because that's a clinical diagnosis, but there's still something that's not, right with him. And he has been, diagnosed with bipolar and all these other stuff. But the self-awareness that he has now, that, he would come up to me after all these years and just apologize, that struck me. Because I had forgotten all about it, but apparently it still bothered him.
Wow.
So the next opportunity he's had to say it, he said it. And it takes a special person to come back and apologize for something that bothers them, whether it bothered you or not, but at least he was willing to make amends and everything.
Did you, as an African-American yourself, did you see something in him and really other fighters too, from a different perspective than a white writer like myself?
I think so. I had more sympathy and empathy for them for coming out of where they came from and carrying that kind of baggage, and then knowing that it didn't matter what level they attained, they were still going to be, they could still walk into a store and be followed by store security because they were black, or there would be people that would cross the street at night to avoid crossing with them because they were black, because they were perceived as a threat. So I think I had more of an empathy for them, even though they had attained a level of financial security and success that, the average American can't even dream of. But they were still going to be, regardless of where they went in this country, they were still going to be a black man in America. Mm-hmm. And, all the baggage that comes with that. So I could connect with them on that level. And, even though you don't have conversations with that, even though you don't necessarily articulate that, there is a level of understanding that a white reporter wouldn't have with a black athlete. But I will say this, it doesn't give you any more of an in with them than it does any other reporter, but there is an understanding. But I think as a black reporter, as an African-American sports reporter, I think that athletes want you to give them the benefit of the doubt, but as a journalist, you have to be true to the craft. You have to be true to objectivity. Mm-hmm. You can't give them the benefit of the doubt when they are in the wrong or when they do something that's not right. You can't do that. And sometimes on that level, they feel like there's a betrayal on your part for not, giving them a slide or whatever. And, that's the duality of being a black sports reporter or a black sports writer, is that you still have to do your job and you still have to do it, at the best and highest standards. Even when you have to cover all athletes the same. You can't make that distinction, but you do have an empathetic feeling for black athletes because you know what they deal with as African-American men and you know where they came from. For the most part, you know where they came from.
And I think that perspective is so important, and not just boxing, but all sports coverage.
All sports. I remember once when I was covering the Bengals, I was coming back from training camp, and Reggie Williams sped and overtook me on the highway. I think it was like Highway 71 or whatever. I can't remember what highway it was. He sped and overtook me and waved me off the side of the road, and I parked at some restaurant or something. And he came up to me and he said, you're the first African-American reporter that I've ever dealt with. And he didn't ask for any special favor. He didn't ask for any special favor, but he said, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm so happy that you're in this role, that you're doing this, because I've never encountered an African-American reporter on a daily basis at any of the stops along the way.
That's really interesting that he wanted to voice that to you.
Yeah, but he was also going to later run for city council.
Right, yeah.
Reggie was the ultimate politician.
Right.
I'm not saying he was working some angle, but he probably was. But
not necessarily.
But it was interesting that he expressed that, and no other athlete at that point had ever expressed that to me. And he said, I hope you, whatever happens in your career, I hope you stick with it, because it's very important that we as athletes see people that look like us in the press.
And he's right.
And he's right.
Well, I think about the conversations like that with Reggie, the conversation you had with Mike Tyson, and you think about the years that you spent writing about sports and the opportunities you had to have those type of conversations. And I think it does give you an insight into something that goes way beyond, Twitter and social media and, what we see on TikTok. It's sometimes the moments that aren't necessarily part of the story that give us a greater understanding about where these guys, where these athletes, where these coaches were coming from. And I think that gets back to the type of access that we were able to get back in those days. It's certainly not like the day when you got to spend 3 hours with the most famous athlete of the last, 60, 70, 50, 60 years?
Yeah.
Muhammad Ali. That type of access, right?
It's unbelievable. And access that he granted and that he invited. Greg Noble, the sports editor at the Cincinnati Enquirer, they were having a card signing, and it was still one of the most eclectic card signings I've ever been to, because it was Billy Martin, Johnny Bench, and I think that Oscar Robertson was there, but it was Muhammad Ali. It was a huge card signing at Riverfront Coliseum.
Those are some big names.
And so Greg says, go down and see if you can talk to Ali, because Ali was the onset of like Parkinson's for Ali.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went down and, I didn't pay because, I was a local reporter. And so I went down and I sidled up to Ali while he was signing some autographs. And I said, I'd like to interview you and talk to you. And he says, well, I'm working right now, but if you come by my hotel room tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, I'll give you all the time you need. And I'm thinking, this guy's setting me up, man. I'm going to go knock on this guy's hotel room. And somebody, some drunk's going to open the door and like punch me in the face. So I go to the hotel, and it's like some airport hotel near the Cincinnati airport. It was in Kentucky. And so I go and I knock on the door, and like Ali comes to the door, and he is larger than life. Basically, I'm about the same height. I mean, he's like 6'2". I'm 6'1". So, but I felt like I was looking up at this monumental figure, when he came to the door, and 7 o'clock in the morning, he's fully dressed. I mean, he's got on like, nice shirt, slacks and everything, dress shoes. And he says, come in. And it's like a suite. So we're in the certain, in one part of the suite, he's like, my kids are sleeping in the other room, so we have to be a little bit quiet. And I was like, okay.
Was Sam Wyche watching the kids?
Sam Wyche was in the other room watching the kids. So for the next 3 hours, I talked to Ali about everything. I mean, you name it, we talked about it. Fighting Frazier at Madison Square Garden. We talked about, being suspended for the 3 years, being a conscientious objector. And I still can't find this thing. He tried to convert me to Islam. He signed like a little Islamic tract for me, gave it to me, and did all of his magic tricks, the cricket behind the ear, the coin from behind the ear. He even levitated. And to this day, I don't know how he did it, but he said, take this piece of paper and slide it under my feet. He said, I'm going to be off the ground. And I literally slid a piece of paper under his feet. He was not touching the ground. He was not touching the ground. Todd, when I tell you the guy wasn't touching the ground, I slid the piece of paper under his feet. And it wasn't a heel to toe thing. It was like literally, he's like, slide. He's like, no, because you're not going to believe it. He's like, slide it from side to side.
Come on.
Paper under his feet. It was the weirdest thing. So, like midway through the interview, this was the wackiest part. Midway through the interview, I'm talking to Ali, and he falls asleep. I mean, just like falls asleep, just like starts, like nods out. And he's sitting there, he's like nodding, and I'm going like, okay, what do I do? Do I get up and leave?
All right.
Am I a creep? I mean, am I going to do the creepy thing and like sit here and watch him sleep? Do I just sit here silently and look at my notes or whatever?
So what happened?
I did the creepy thing. I sat there and watched Ali sleep. So I'm like, I can't leave. I can try to wake him up and tell him, but he woke up. When he woke up, he was refreshed. He was great. He at that point, his voice was softer, but he wasn't like showing any signs of, other than nodding out, he wasn't showing any signs of like, the Parkinson's having a major effect on him or anything. He did his Ali shuffle. He told me that he would beat Ali. I mean, he told me that he would beat Mike Tyson, and and it wouldn't take him as long as it would take him to beat Sonny Liston. I was like, wow, really? He said, yeah. He said, he's very fast. He's strong. He said, but I'm faster and I'm stronger. And I'm like, okay, whatever you say, Mr. Ali.
Hey, man, he levitates. I'm not betting against the greatest.
Yeah, I'm not betting against the guy who can get up off the ground.
Well, Tim, those are the kind of moments that I'm sure you treasure from your career as a sports writer. And I know that readers and sports fans were lucky to have reporters such as yourself who got that type of access and were able to tell the type of stories behind the scenes. And I really enjoyed, this time catching up with you and feel very fortunate about the stories you were able to share with us, and I want to thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me, Todd. And I think what you're doing is very good, and just trying to make sure that that this legacy lives on, and the people that you're talking to, because I think we're in terms of sports journalism, we're heading in a direction that's not going to be anything like when we came along. So I'm glad you're storing these.
Well, thank you. I'm going to send you some chocolate chip cookies just for saying that.
I need a 4-mile cookie.
All right, Tim, you take care.
Okay, Todd. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcomed here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcasts. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Huffman, and our audio engineer Dave Douglas. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not. It's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.